Hello everyone. Today's presentation is covering the rise of psychology as a science and how four major ideas helped shape our perspective. So, how did these four major movements come to shape our modern perspective of psychology? First, functionalism demonstrates the utility within mental processes that can help us adapt to our environments. Second, Gestalt psychology brings to light the importance of understanding the whole picture of a situation, as it affects our perception, as well as how and why our brain organizes information the way it does. Third, psychobiology explains the relationship between our brain and our expressed behavior. 4. Cognitive psychology explains how humans meaningfully transform information presented to them via their social lens. These four movements will go on to raise the bar for psychology, elevating it to a respectable science. Let's begin diving into functionalism. This movement started in the 1800s in the United States, prominently shaped and formed by William James, who emphasized the how and why the mind functions the way it does. His approach towards psychology was to measure the practical effects and usefulness of an idea and the practical difference it makes in our lives. This way we can conceptualize the form, beliefs that help us navigate the world and solve problems. Furthermore, James believed that consciousness was a continuous stream. Additionally, he believed habits form from the desire to be efficient and that emotions are simply the perception to our bodily changes. Another prominent figure in shaping functionalism, Hugo, a German psychologist who paved the way to the idea that psychological science could directly inform our laws, our workplace, and our everyday life, additionally playing an important role in shifting the image of American psychology towards one that reflects practicality and problem solving. Mary Wilton Calkins, who trained both under James and Hugo, would go on to develop the pair-associate technique, which is used to strengthen the memory. She'd also go on to emphasize the importance of the self and how it's actually central to both our consciousness and our lived experience. Her work serves as a perfect reminder that psychology at its core is a study of human experience in action. Meanwhile, Edward Thorndike would use puzzle boxes to understand how people learn through trial and error, by demonstrating how at first people's behaviors is awkward and uncoordinated, but as they continue to repeat the trials, their actions become cleaner and more efficient, demonstrating how behaviors followed by satisfying outcomes strengthen the behavior. Meanwhile, behaviors followed by discomfort weaken it. Additionally, it demonstrates how the stimulus-response connection, if repeated, and the more it is repeated, the more that connection is strengthened. Thorndike's puzzle boxes would ultimately set the foundation for what later would be B.F. Skinner's operating condition. Two more prominent figures in functionalism worthy of noting are Kenneth and Mamie Clark, a husband and wife African-American duo who showed the psychological effects segregation has on African-American children. Their work is the pivotal argument in the Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education, and it was ultimately their work that helped declare racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional. Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychology started in the 1900s in Germany as a direct opposition to structuralism, arguing that breaking experiences into isolated parts makes one lose sight of what really matters. And what he believed truly mattered is being able to see the whole picture. This can best be explained through Wertheimer's five phenomenon, or in a more relatable and much more tangible experiment would be referencing a movie, actually. Because even though we are seeing individual picture frames The picture frames are moving in such a rapid succession that it allows our brain to perceive the idea of fluid motion by filling in the missing gaps. Wolfgang Kohler, a key figure in gestalt psychology, who's best known for his studies of learning and in chimpanzees. This experiment would go on to directly challenge the dominant learning model of trial and error. The experiment consisted of challenging chimpanzees with problems that couldn't be solved by random trial and error alone. Lo and behold, he came to find that chimpanzees are capable of insight learning, meaning they have a capacity to figure out a solution all at once, similar to an aha moment, rather than slowly trying random things until something works. This discovery would indicate how animals, and in this case including humans, are capable of cognitive reorganization, or in other words, being able to have the capacity to intentionally shift our internal worldview and mental patterns. Also proving that we do not have to rely solely on mechanical conditioning. Wolfgang would go on to form the belief that our brain patterns mirrors the patterns we perceive in the world, referring to this as isomorphism. Moving on to Kurt Lewin, someone who would describe behavior as the function of a person and their environment, and demonstrating how behavior can't be fully understood without first considering the entirety of the context. He would go on to expand the idea of what consists as our environment, including what he refers to as a life space, which in short is the medical physical experiences we manage, such as our goals and the social pressures we face. He would also go on to identify the three forms of psychological conflict, which include approach, or where one chooses between two good options, avoidance, where one chooses between two bad options, or approach avoidance, where one choice has both good and bad aspects. And this, in short, sums up Gestalt psychology, as it insists in seeing the whole picture and identifying key patterns within it. Gestalt psychology would mark an era where it was no longer enough to simply understand the parts that made the whole, and rather shifts our focus to understanding how the whole shapes and organizes the parts. Psychobiology. The shift of attention towards the biological basis of thought and behavior, with American psychologists such as Carl Lashley challenging the idea that there are specific areas in the brain which are responsible for psychological functions. Because even after decades of searching for an engram of a physical trace within the brain, all he found and all he came to conclude is that there is no single cortical area responsible for storing memory, and that learning and memory rather depends on the cortex as a whole, rather than any isolated part. The only direct causation he did know was that removing larger amounts of cortical tissue did lead to greater impairments. Additionally, and interestingly, he did also find that different parts of the cortex can actually take over the functions of damaged areas within reason, which highlights how our brain functions are so flexible. Donald Hebb, better known as the father of neuropsychology, would link behavior, thoughts, and learning to brain function, and would famously state, neurons that fire together wire together, implying how neurons that are active at the same time are capable of forming stronger connections. He would also go on to be responsible for setting the stage of modern AI neural network models through his ideas of self-assembly and phase sequence. Lastly, Roger Perries, a neuropsychologist and neurophysiologist who's best known for his split brain study, where patients underwent a surgical severing of the corpus callosum in order to reduce side effects of their epilepsy, which led him to discover the specialization between the left and the right hemisphere of the brain, and how consciousness could theoretically also be split, considering each hemisphere has its own perceptions and awareness. The emergence of psychobiology seems to have been a natural progression and direct byproduct of our modern world and high-tech industry, which has increased both the accuracy and efficiency in our test and data collection. Cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology, a revolution that allowed us to reframe the mind as an active processor of information. Prominent figures such as Frederick Bartlett argued how memory is reconstructive. Meanwhile, Jean Piaget would actually go on to successfully identify the stages of cognitive development, which include sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational, and notes that each phase highlights how knowledge develops through the child interacting with their environment. Meanwhile, the works of George Miller help us understand working memory, particularly his paper, The Magical Number 7 plus or minus 2, which set the golden standard for working memory. Moving on to Noam Chomsky, an American linguist and philosopher who proposed humans are born with innate language faculty, which explains how children are capable of learning despite limited input, also known as the poverty of stimulus argument, which pretty much explains how a toddler hears messy and incomplete sentences from adults like "want a cookie" or "go park," yet within a few years can build complex sentences with grammar rules. No one ever directly taught them the grammar rules. Hence, the input is poor, but the learning remains rich. Noam uses this as the prime example as to why humans must be born with innate language faculty. Chomsky would also go on to formally make linguistics a science, as well as establish cognitive psychology as a dominant paradigm that brings linguistic psychology and computer science into the conversation and allows us to explore the mind through symbols, codes, and processing. The history of psychology is a sentiment of its adaptable, self-reflective, and perceptive nature, which allows it to identify new evidence, correct misunderstandings, and reframe the ever-evolving question of our purpose, leaving a holistic psychology that's capable of prioritizing our needs, adapting to our circumstances, understands the importance of the whole, and realizes the capacity we hold to intentionally reorganize our world and what we're perceiving in order to give meaning to everything in our life.